Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Continuamos con nuestra programación. En este momento tengo el gusto de presentar a Joan Wheeler, del Reino Unido. Joan es una destacada experta en el campo del derecho, la política, la regulación y las cuestiones del efecto de los satélites y el espacio, así como en contratos comerciales, habiendo trabajado en Ofcom, la Agencia Espacial Europea, y durante más de 20 años en la práctica jurídica privada de este ámbito jurídico. Tuvo el honor de representar a la ESA y al Reino Unido en un curso. Fue galardonada con un máster por sus servicios en la industria espacial del Reino Unido en 2017. Está clasificada como Tier 1 de los directorios legales. Joan ganó el Premio Innovador Jurídico Europeo del año de Financial Times en 2014. Es cofundadora y presidenta de la Satellite Finance Network y de la Prosperous Space Fellowship. También es directora de Earth and Space Sustainability Initiative. Es miembro de la Real Sociedad Astronómica, la Real Sociedad Aeronáutica, y vicepresidenta del Centro Nacional de Espacio. Copreside el Consejo de Seguridad y la Reglamentación de Vuelos Espaciales del Gobierno británico y fue nombrada profesora honoraria por esta Universidad de Leicester el año 2022. Joan, ¿cuánto gusto?
Además de Joan, se va a unir a la presentación de ella Steve Plant, quien trabaja en la Agencia Espacial del Reino Unido. Se unió a la Agencia Espacial en 2017 para apoyar la redacción de legislación secundaria para implementar la Ley de la Industria Espacial de 2018. Steve está trabajando actualmente en pólizas de seguro y responsabilidad para actividades orbitales, incluido un nuevo enfoque para establecer límites de responsabilidad para operaciones satelitales, nuevos terceros potenciales y modelos de seguros de responsabilidad de partes y desarrollos de marcos de seguros y responsabilidad para respaldar nuevos tipos de misiones. Steve tiene casi 25 años de experiencia en políticas de la administración pública del Reino Unido, con funciones anteriores que abarcan cuestiones de salud animal, desarrollo de programas culturales y políticas de comercio de carbono. Dejamos ahora la palabra a los dos expositores. Muchas gracias.
Hello, good evening, everybody. My name's Steve Plant, as mentioned. Apologies, there appears to be some issues with my camera, so I can't see you all, or you can't see me at the moment. But firstly, may I say what a great honour and pleasure it is to be able to speak with you today about this really important topic. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do so. And may I also thank colleagues at the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs for the opportunity to present to you today about the United Kingdom's national perspective on safety and sustainability of outer space activities. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the UK's current framework is covered by, I think I'll just stop my video there now. Hello, thank you for starting the video. Thank you very much. Good to see you. So the UK's current framework is covered by two main pieces of legislation. These are the Outer Space Act 1986 and the Space Industry Act 2018. These set out the high-level scope for the UK's licensing framework and implement the UK's international obligations on space into UK law. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The Acts enable the licensing of a range of different types of space activities. The Outer Space Act 1986 regulates space activities carried out by UK entities where those activities take place overseas. The Space Industry Act 2018 regulates spaceflight activities which take place from the UK. The Space Industry Act was developed to enable launch activities to take place from the UK, and the UK conducted its first launch in January this year. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Looking at the Space Industry Act in some more detail then, the Act is not the only part of the regulatory framework for licensing spaceflight activities which take place from the UK. Whilst the Act sets out the high-level enabling framework for commercial spaceflight activity operations carried out in the UK, the Act is supported by more detailed provisions in secondary legislation, in this case, the Space Industry Regulations, as well as more detailed guidance on the different license types, activities, and specific topics that are covered within the Act. Importantly, the Act also established a new independent regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, to carry out licensing and monitoring activity for activities covered by both the Space Industry Act and the Outer Space Act. The CAA has been carrying out these responsibilities since July 2021. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The Space Industry Act covers a wide range of topics to reflect the provisions needed to support spaceflight activities from the UK. This includes, but is not limited to, themes such as what can be covered by licenses and conditions which can be included in the license, requirements on safety and security, liability and insurance, as well as provisions on range control for launch activities. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. On this slide, you can see how the UK's regulatory framework covers the wide range of spaceflight activities, including different methods of launch activities and activities needed to support launch, such as spaceports and range control. Many of these are covered by the Outer Space Act and the Space Industry Act, but the acts have also been designed to interact with wider domestic aviation law. This ensures that there is no gap in regulatory coverage between the different types of spaceflight activity. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. In terms of the UK's approach to safety of space activities, safety is paramount. The UK, as mentioned, has an independent regulator, the Civil Aviation Authority, to assess licence applications and consider safety. It is a requirement under the Space Industry Act that the regulator must exercise the regulator's functions with regard to spaceflight activities with a view to securing public safety. This duty has priority over other considerations that the regulator also has to take into account. All space-related activity is licensed, and these licenses can contain conditions that the operator must meet. As part of the licensing process, applicants must demonstrate that they have mitigated risks to as low as reasonably practicable. This means that operators are not required to eliminate all risks, but have identified such risks and have taken actions needed to reduce these risks in a proportionate way. You can find out more detail about this approach on the Civil Aviation Authority's website. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The UK views regulation as a key enabler for space activities. As well as enabling activities that would otherwise be prohibited, the UK's legislative framework is outcome focused. Therefore, rather than specifying how something should be done, the legislation sets out the themes that operators have to consider and demonstrates how they have addressed those matters. In this way, the legislation can cater for a wide range of mission types, and the UK has experience of licensing new novel technologies and mission types, such as large constellations, active debris removal demonstration missions, using this approach. The UK is, however, developing new regulatory frameworks to cater for novel mission types that are being developed by commercial operators, but without the need to make changes to legislation. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. These mission types include activities such as active debris removal and in-orbit manufacturing missions, and for the longer term, space-based solar power. The UK government and the Civil Aviation Authority are working closely with operators to develop the framework for such missions. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Looking at active debris removal activity, this is a novel, higher risk activity, and there is a complex set of relationships between the parties involved in such proposed operations. There are further challenges in cases where the jurisdiction of the object to be removed is different to the jurisdiction of the operator conducting the removal of that object. The UK government has therefore been working with colleagues from New Zealand on a new, flexible, non-binding arrangement for consensual joint active debris removal and in-orbit servicing missions. This arrangement will set out the roles and responsibilities of each state, principles covering liability sharing models, and transparency and information sharing measures. The purpose behind this arrangement is to reduce policy and regulatory uncertainty, but also ensure that activity is consistent with international law. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. On space sustainability, the UK has already implemented the UN's long-term sustainability guidelines and the IADC's debris mitigation guidelines into its regulatory framework. These are reflected in guidance and also in legislation by requiring the regulator to take into account space debris mitigation guidelines issued by an international organisation in which the UK government is represented. Space sustainability is increasingly a focus for the UK government. It is a key objective in its national space strategy, and the UK government is also embedding sustainability into policy proposals. Sustainability is also a priority for the UK space sector. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The UK government announced at the 4th Summit for Space Sustainability, held in London in June 2022, a new plan for space sustainability to demonstrate UK leadership in sustainable space, in line with ambitions set out in the UK's National Space Strategy. The UK government is also reviewing its orbital regulatory framework to incentivise sustainable practices, investment and growth. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. It is important that the UK government works closely with the space sector. This is to ensure that the sector and government initiatives are aligned in their overall outcomes, as well as engaging with industry to ensure that the UK's regulatory frameworks can support commercial activities. The UK government is also engaging with the space sector to develop space policy. For example, the UK government set up a working group consisting of a range of UK licensed operators, insurers, academics, UK space sector experts, as well as UK government officials and UK's spaceflight regulator to inform the government's thinking on developing a new approach to setting liability limits for satellite operations, with missions assessed against a number of space sustainability criteria. Where operators adopt more sustainable measures as part of their missions, this will result in lower limits of operator liability, which are then set out as conditions in an operator's licence. I will now hand over to Joanne to talk about the key initiative being developed by the UK space sector.
Thank you very much, Steve. It is a real pleasure to be here, everybody, and to be able to speak on such an important topic. Thank you to Rosanna and Mattia and to the UNCOPUOS and the Chilean representatives and ambassador. It's a privilege and a pleasure to engage with you all. May I begin, if we can move ahead to the next slide, please, by quoting the King Charles III. He said, "We must develop a sustainable way, a durable way of benefiting from space, just as we must here on Earth." And in the King's Astra Carta, there is a recognition of our shared responsibility for the Earth and space ecosystem. And this is important, as to date, states have registered radio frequencies with the International Telecommunication Union for more than 1.7 million non-geostationary satellites that may be launched into orbit as early as 2030. And according to AXA, there were 186 launches last year, which carried a total of 2,500 satellites. Only 340 satellites were insured during launch. And as for the satellites in orbit, there are 7,000 active satellites last year. And of the 6,100 in LEO, only 63 satellites were insured. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, currently, there is a lack of binding international rules on space sustainability and a lack of consistent national implementation of the current guidelines. And existing international voluntary standards tend to be made binding through licensing requirements and through procurement and other contracts. And states are encouraged by UNCOPUS to take measures to implement the long-term sustainability guidelines nationally. But we cannot assume that states will do this homogeneously and create incentives to ensure responsible behaviour by commercial operators. And some states do need to understand the implications of implementation and how to do this to ensure that the framework is attractive, enabling and growth creating. If you go to the next slide, please. The difference will come when the standards are implemented consistently at national level, and there's a level playing field when industry incentivized to adopt responsible behaviours. We are some way away from that at the moment. So how is this achieved? To influence and enable, but without hindering commercial activities and innovation. And how do we encourage responsible behaviour with greater accountability? And how do we drive the race to the top in sustainable practices? Well, the recent focus on space sustainability has magnified the importance of the private sector availing itself of licenses from well-respected, balanced, transparent regulatory systems that take space sustainability seriously. Good regulation leads to sustainability goals in industry and is investment enabling. And good regulation is increasingly deemed to include environmental, social, and governance, ESG criteria. And investors are increasingly demanding a compelling ESG plan as a driver of financial value. If we go into the next slide, please. So these aspects were the catalyst of the Earth and Space Sustainability Initiative, which is dedicated to enhancing and developing the benefits of space for all life and future generations. And to achieve this goal, SE has developed a set of space sustainability principles that will facilitate the establishment of space sustainability standards at an international level. And to ensure inclusion, transparency, and fairness, SE seeks to bring together the worlds of the global space industry, finance, insurance, academia, governments, regulators, and policies makers across the world, international organizations, and the public. And we have been so far fully supported by the UK Space Agency. If we go into the next slide, please. So SE, along with industry and the finance and insurance communities, have devised these set of principles down the left-hand side from which the international standards will be formed. The principles take a holistic approach covering the life cycle of a satellite from design, manufacture, right through to disposal, and also cover dark skies, quiet skies, radio frequency spectrum, Earth observation, and resource management. And we would very much welcome collaborators in all of this work. So please be in contact. We can jump to the next slide, please. In relation to the key objectives for the space sustainability standards, these seek to ensure the sustainable use of outer space, covering that life cycle of the satellite. They seek to attract greater and wider investment into the space industry through that ESG investment criteria. They provide transparency and confidence to investors in regard to what is a sustainable space activity with effective practices and an ESG focus. They ensure a better insurance risk, and with insurance comes finance. Better insurance risk through objective due diligence criteria, verified data, and a greater focus towards reliability and sustainability. They provide accreditation and recognition to sustainability products and practices not otherwise accredited or certified, and therefore allow companies with such products and practices to raise investment, and allow market access in other states by establishing this sustainable criteria. And they can potentially lead to lower insurance requirements and liability caps in accordance with a new variable liability approach, which the UK Space Agency are consulting on currently. And we very much thank that engagement with the Space Agency. If we can go to the next slide, please. So SE is engaging widely with industry, governments, regulators, policymakers, and the public through a comprehensive and inclusive engagement campaign. And SE seeks to drive conversations through three main strands. Number one is the space industry globally, finance and insurance community. We have to thank Lloyd's of London in this regard, which underwrite 85% of everything in space, who are completely backing this. The UK, but also importantly, other governments, regulators across the world and international organizations. And other governments and regulators can adopt these standards. We know the Swiss and the Canadians are looking to adopt them and use them in relation to their existing licensing or market access criteria. And the public and Indigenous people across the world communicating with a person on the street as to the importance of space sustainability and their uses of space. And UNOOSA will host an international workshop in January of next year, and we also hope to do a workshop with Octubre later on next year. If we could move ahead, please. Now, SE is complementary with other initiatives, but it's also unique. The difference is that it takes this inclusive, holistic approach, also looking at culture, the interests of all users of space and Indigenous peoples, right through to finance and insurance. Next slide, please. Now, the first document that SE drafted is the Memorandum of Principles for Space Sustainability. It's now been signed by 132 space companies, academic institutions, finance, insurance communities, and organizations across the world, and also Indigenous leaders. The signatories seek to promote and facilitate international cooperation and understanding of the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and establish transparent principles of responsible behavior. They seek to recognize that actually there are challenges ahead, but we're proud to work collaboratively, adding knowledge and experience to enable a robust pursuit of excellence in regard to sustainability, and to stand sure and united to protect the significance, use, and exploration of outer space to an international, diverse, inclusive, and multidisciplinary approach, which is very important. Next slide, please. Now, in understanding the standards that exist already and the gap analysis, what does exist, what does not exist, and whether the gaps should be filled, we've identified over 1,700 current space sustainability standards. We've also collated all of these standards into a database and added related finance and insurance metrics. It's a world first, and we hope to publish this later this year to be used and accessed by everyone. The next slide, please. So throughout all of this space sustainability work, engagement between industry, governments across the world, and regulators is essential. Space sustainability standards can be applied in licensing conditions, procurement contracts, market access conditions, and, for example, conditions for membership of a possible new mutual liability insurance model that we're working with the UK Space Agency on. But they can also be linked to finance, insurance, market access, licensing to help the integrity and usability of space for future generations and preserve Earth as it looks after us back on Earth. So outer space has been our constant from the very beginning, influencing our cultures, our life, inspiring science, engaging our creative and our adventurous personalities. It's part of our ecosystem, and we depend on it now more than we have ever before, and increasingly so. So SE is an example of the excellent collaboration between the UK government and industry around the world, and now academia and other governments. And we very much hope to be able to collaborate with many of you on the call today. Thank you so much. We're very happy to take questions.
Gracias, Steve, por esta presentación. Dejamos el espacio abierto por si hubiesen preguntas. No tenemos preguntas, así que Dejo la palabra a la embajadora Carmen Amarillo, ¿no? Dejamos el espacio entonces para una pregunta más a los expositores.
Thank you very much. It's also a very nice conference and explanation. I would like to know if those concepts are used only in UK or they're for the whole Europe. You know.
I believe the question was, are these concepts used in the UK or the whole of Europe? Is that correct?
Yes, the person who is speaking said yes, but he hasn't the microphone. The microphone.
Shall I try and answer that question? There are a few concepts that we have mentioned this evening that are, I suppose, the UK are seeking to be thought leaders in. So, Steve, one of them, of course, is the variable limit of liability, that maybe you could just add a sentence on. The other one is a mutual model of insurance that is not active in the space domain at all at the moment. The model is actually from the maritime and nuclear sector, but we're looking at the mutual model as a possible new addition to make it easier for small satellites and constellations to have third-party liability insurance for a much lower cost as part of a mutual fund that is industry driven. But Steve, would you like to maybe just add a sentence or two on a variable liability limits that the UK Space Agency are working on? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Joanne, and thank you for the question. So yes, the variable liability limit is something that we've developed in response to feedback from the space sector in the UK that the UK's insurance requirements are uncompetitive. And so therefore the UK government undertook a review of the framework and actually thinking about the concept of sustainability, developed a proposal to link the two. So to provide operators with the opportunity and to hopefully incentivize operators to adopt more sustainable measures, and in that case reduce the amount of insurance that operators needed to take out. So that we understand is a world first approach, as well as the other measures that Joanne has mentioned as well. So what we're looking to do is to combine these measures. So look at the amount of insurance that is required, how that insurance can be delivered as compared with the current model for providing insurance, and also linking into the space sustainability standard as a package to then bring those together to help reduce operator costs for those operators that are looking to adopt these more sustainable practices. And so I think the UK government is also very keen to look at opportunities for where this sort of approach could be extended to other different policy areas as well. So it's part of an evolving process. And we are, as Joanne said, in consultation on this, but I think it's the start of a process. So it's a very clear change to the way that we have set insurance requirements previously, and we'll also be looking for other opportunities to expand the sustainability into future policy measures as well.
And Steve, can I just add that the liability limits will have, as you just said, links to sustainability criteria, and the mutual model, if it is moving forward, can also be the membership of the mutual club, shall we say, can also be based on space sustainability criteria.
That's absolutely correct. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. May we jump ahead? There's one question gone into the chat. May we answer that? Shall I just move ahead? This is from Andy Williams. And he is saying that if the UK establishes a very strict limits on liability, operators may choose other authorities to register satellites through. Ideally, we should have a global accepted standard. Ideally, we should have a global... Oh, sorry, am I interrupting someone? No, ideally, we should have a global accepted standard, but as I mentioned in my presentation, I think we're a little bit away from a level playing field. So as Steve has just mentioned, there has been a mention that the UK limits of liability and dealing with insurance are potentially uncompetitive. The Space Agency have absolutely listened to this and are looking at the tiered liability approach, and that is also a catalyst for this mutual model approach. So actually, it is not so much very strict limit, it is limits that are based on responsible behavior, and also through the work of the sustainability standards based on sustainability criteria. And before ESSI was set up, over the last several years of this, we have been consulting widely with industry, also other governments, but importantly, the finance and insurance sector, because also we're hoping that the criteria that the UK government are using will also allow greater investment into the space landscape and a better insurance risk, leading to easier access to insurance. And the accessibility of insurance is very important because 6 major underwriters have left the space market, and we're aware of several others leaving. And therefore, we're looking at something that is practical, that is industry-led and driven, also with finance and insurance. And we have to thank the UK Space Agency for actually evolving their regulatory requirements to actually meet the industry needs. Steve, do you have anything else to add on the UK establishing very strict limits?
I don't know. I think it comes back to looking at this as a package, and as you say, the sustainability developments on that front and the access to the finance and the insurance, which is something we wanted to link together. So whilst looking at the level of the insurance is an important factor, I think it's actually part of the wider discussion around that access to finance and the insurance, of bringing that together as a comprehensive linked in package. And I think this is why it's really important to work with the sector as these initiatives develop to make sure that these goals are aligned. And so I think that sense we've designed things in that way to be able to bring in all of these different elements. And I think one of the things we'll also do is evolve this over time as well. So as international and national understanding around sustainability becomes clearer, we can then amend our approach on the variable liability limit to reflect that new thinking and those new priorities that the UK wishes to promote on the sustainability front.
Agradecemos la excelente presentación de ambos panelistas y con ello damos por concluida esta sección. Muchas gracias. A continuación, vamos a presentar al señor Niklas Hedman. Debiéramos tenerlo en pantalla en un momento. Niklas, ahí está.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
absolutely. Thank you. I have to use my laptop.
Use your, Niklas?
Yes.
I will give me a second, please.
Thank you.
El señor Hedman es vicepresidente del Grupo sobre Protección Planetaria del Comité de Investigaciones Espaciales, COSPA. Desde marzo de 1922 hasta septiembre de 2023, fue designado director de funciones de la Oficina de Naciones Unidas de Asuntos del Espacio Extraterrestre, UNOOSA. Durante 18 años fue jefe de la sección de Comité de Políticas de Asuntos Jurídicos de la UNOOSA, donde desempeñó el cargo de secretario de la Comisión sobre la Utilización del Espacio Ultraterrestre con fines pacíficos, y de la Subcomisión de Asuntos Científicos y Técnicos, y su Subcomisión de Asuntos Jurídicos. Antes de incorporarse a las Naciones Unidas en el 2006, trabajó en el Ministerio Sueco de Asuntos Exteriores representando a Suecia ante la COPUOS durante 10 años y trabajando en las áreas de asuntos oceánicos y derecho del mar, asuntos espaciales y derecho espacial, así como desarme y control de armamentos. Recibió el Premio Servicio Distinguido del Instituto Internacional del Derecho Espacial el año 2017. Welcome.
Thank you indeed. Thank you so much. And so good to see you again. And I will try to share my screen. All right. Okay, so here we go. I will deal with two distinct areas of the way that we handle our activities on planetary bodies in the solar system and also protecting planet Earth, namely planetary protection and planetary defense. And they are quite different, these two features of human activities in outer space. If we look first at space multilateralism and governance, we can immediately see that there are certain complexities. It's like a matrix of activities that range from activities in orbits around planet Earth, as we know, and also activities, both current, past, and future activities on the moon and other celestial bodies. And obviously, planet Earth itself, it's also at the center of space activities. And what you can see on the slide is what I will focus primarily today is on planetary protection and on planetary defense. But I wanted to give you this complexity overview in a kind of a cross-cutting projection because, as we know, and this is what COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, is also dealing with heavily. And we have also already heard Joanne Wheeler talking about the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, where we have, of course, the security, safety, and sustainability concerns being raised. And now I will jump over to a completely different topic, but a topic that also in the future will have a relationship to activities, particularly on the moon and other celestial bodies, and that is also ranging into the area of space resource activities, as we know. What is important to note here is that we are all striving for some sort of order in our space activities, and predominantly it's a way to look into how we can foster predictability, consistency, and interoperability, while at the same time, and this is the complex matter, balancing interests, mainly policy interest, governance interest, commercial interest from private sector, and scientific interest for scientific investigation of our solar system. Planetary protection derives from Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, and this is the longest and perhaps the most complex provision in the Outer Space Treaty, with several core principles and terminology that are not defined. Due regard is not defined in the context of international space law as it is phrased in the Outer Space Treaty. Harmful contamination is not defined by the Outer Space Treaty, and harmful interference neither. What is interesting to note is that there is a connection, particularly between the principle of due regard to the corresponding interests of other states parties and the avoidance of potentially harmful interference. And that goes all the way back to the early 60s when the treaty was being negotiated. What is interesting to note is that in the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles, and I assume that you all know that declaration, Article 9 is included as one of the core principles already at that stage in 1963, but without harmful contamination. So it was only at that time due regard and harmful interference. Harmful contamination came in the years after the declaration, and there were a lot of negotiations on what to do with the issue of contamination and how to treat that. And the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR, had an important role in that regard. And the result was what you see on the screen, Article 9, with these 3 elements included. COSPAR in the early 60s, or I would say right after the declaration, had some quite important prominence in supporting the negotiations of the Outer Space Treaty, as we know, was adopted in 1967. And if you look at the 1964 Kupus report, you will see that the committee included verbatim the COSPAR Executive Council resolution with appendices. And what is interesting here to note is that COSPAR, this organization, had already worked on harmful effects of space experiments, and predominantly on the pollution of upper atmospheres in the case of launchings, but also on orbiting dipoles. And this stems from the so-called West Forward project of the United States at that time, and which was contested by the Soviet Union. But COSPAR also started at this time to look into contamination of the moon and other celestial bodies, and set up the panel on standards for space probe sterilization, which is the precursor to the current panel on planetary protection. If we look at the legal framework for planetary protection, I have already mentioned Article 9, the element on harmful contamination, and also the protection of the biosphere of planet Earth. What is also important to note is Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, and you are all familiar with it, where it says that states parties shall bear international responsibility for national space activities. And here it includes, obviously, governmental agencies, but also non-governmental entities. And here we are quite attentive to this provision in terms of contemporary and future activities by private sector. Planetary protection is really about protecting further scientific investigation of the moon and other celestial bodies. So it's not an environmental mechanism. It's not concerned really with the protection or preservation of the environment itself of those celestial bodies, but really the conduct of scientific investigation. And what you can see in the shaded paragraph on the screen, firstly, the conduct of scientific investigations of possible extraterrestrial life forms, precursors and remnants must not be jeopardized. And that is what we in the planetary protection community label as forward contamination. And then in addition, the Earth, and particularly its biosphere, must be protected from the potential hazard posed by extraterrestrial matters carried by a spacecraft returning from an interplanetary mission. And this is what we label as backward contamination. COSPAR developed in the 80s and 90s, developed a policy which is a voluntary, non-legally binding instrument that sets down categories, a categorization of the various target bodies in the solar system, and also how missions to those target bodies, and those target bodies can be the moon, Mars, other planets, but also moons of planets, particularly the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, but also asteroids. So it is a non-legally binding voluntary instrument, but this panel of COSPAR has set up a mechanism whereby national space agencies of major spacefaring nations are involved, so that states do implement the requirements and the guidance and the standard being developed by this panel on planetary protection. And here you see the membership of the panel currently. As I already said, it comprises representatives of space agencies, but also independent scientific expertise. This is a highly complex science area, and therefore it is important to have all those related fields and disciplines represented. I want just to show this slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but this is the essence of this policy instrument, the categorization of target bodies and missions to those bodies. And category 1 is the lowest and category 4 the highest. What I wanted you to take away from this slide is that the moon is in category 2, meaning that there is really not that much harm that can be made to future scientific investigation on the moon. But if we take Mars as an example, there we have to be careful, and we really need to have those protocols and for protecting scientific investigation of the chemical evolution and also origin of life on the surface and subsurface of Mars. And furthermore, in the outer solar system, attention is really being paid to the 2 particular bodies, the moon Europa of Jupiter and the moon Enceladus of Saturn. And there are other similar moons and also planets and other objects in the solar system that actually harbors water. And the issue with Europa and Enceladus particularly is that they are covered with an ice crust, and underneath there are quite large deposits of water, could even be oceans. So the probability of life forms in the water of those bodies is quite high, but we don't know. So this is really where further scientific investigations are important. Category 5 is particularly important when it comes to sample return missions, because that is really where we protect the biosphere of planet Earth, so that from missions to the outer solar system and even for Mars, it is really fundamental that we don't contaminate our biosphere with any extraterrestrial organisms. And there are unrestricted and restricted returns. So restricted means that there is a full protocol of protective mechanisms set in motion, and unrestricted means that there is really not that stringency involved. So I wanted you just to have that picture before you. With the moon, it's interesting to note that for years, the moon has been category 2, and you remember the categories I had on the previous slide. Category 2 means that there is really not that much you need to do. There is documentation only, but this documentation from the missions under category 2 include organic inventory. What we did in 2021 in the COSPAR panel was to update, in a way, relax, you might say, the requirements for the moon, so that we have a more stringent requirement for the polar regions, the South Pole and the North Poles, as well as permanently shadowed regions of the moon. And the rest of the surface of the moon is category 2A, which means that you have more relaxed documentation requirements. So this is the latest update made to the planetary protection policy of COSPAR. I've already mentioned certain features of the outer solar system. I'm not going to go into that further. What is upcoming, and you have probably heard of it, is the Mars Sample Return Mission, which is a joint venture between NASA and the European Space Agency. It is planned to be launched around 2027, 2030, and will go on, of course, for many years. And the whole idea is to bring samples back from planet Mars back to Earth. So you can imagine that the stringency of the requirements and the protocols for harmful contamination, particularly of planet Earth, is very high in that regard. As some examples of governance, I have already mentioned the fundamental principles enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty, which are directly relevant to planetary protection objectives, and how states, the major spacefaring nations that do those missions in the future, and their national constituents under their jurisdiction are obliged. And here we have Article 6, as I already mentioned, and Article 9 of the treaty. In 2017, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space acknowledged the work of COSPAR in maintaining its planetary protection policy, as you can see, which is again stipulated as a reference standard for spacefaring nations in guiding their compliance with Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. So that was a statement made by COPUS in 2017. 2019 guidelines on the long-term sustainability, the LTS guidelines, is interesting because in one chapter, the guidelines also deal with scientific research. And there is a paragraph which you can see at the bottom of this slide, which also acknowledges the importance of working towards planetary protection. So in a way, at the governance level, and particularly then through the work of the intergovernmental body of COPUS, there is a recognition of the importance of planet protection, particularly the policy which is agreed by national space agencies and their governments, and also in that sense, the work of COSPAR. And I should have said it earlier, COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, was founded in 1958. So it's a long-standing scientific body. It's a non-governmental organization. Now I move over to the next item, and that's planetary defense. So planetary defense, or as we label it within COPUS, near-Earth objects, is really a way for space agencies, for governments, obviously, and also for the research community, for observatories in various countries, research institutes and universities to really come together and coordinate and share information on how we are to handle a potential catastrophic event with a near-Earth object impacting planet Earth. So this is really what it is about. And I know that in Latin America, some countries are already involved in this mechanism, particularly in this International Asteroid Warning Network, IWAN, and the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group. If I'm not mistaken, in some page, the Mexican Space Agency is a member, and for IWAN, we have, for instance, of course, ESO, European Southern Observatory, and we have also in Mexico an Institute of Astrophysics, in Colombia a university, and an observatory of Brazil. Since we have here before us the Chile Technical Advisory Mission on Space Law, I should also mention that the La Silla Observatory is being used on the territory of Chile to really detect and really trying to detect incoming near-Earth objects. So Chile is at the forefront when it comes to planetary defense. And as we know, the observatory is an ESO, European Southern Observatory installation. So I have a few slides here that I don't intend to really go through, but I wanted you to have this information because there might be other space agencies of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also research institutes and observatories that wish to be connected with the work on planetary defense. So IWAN, the International Asteroid Warning Network, is really a contact point for researchers and for observatories to get together and share information and coordinate their observations. While SAMPAGE, the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, is comprised of representatives of national space agencies, and that group is really looking more into the operational aspect of actually what to do if there should be a danger from a near-Earth object approaching planet Earth. Key contact for both IWAN and SAMPAGE are here on this slide, so you might wish to consult this presentation afterwards in case you are interested in becoming part of this international global network. For the sake of clarity, I have to mention that the SAMPAGE Secretariat is being performed by UNOOSA and with its secretary, Romana Koffler, who is a colleague to Rosanna and Yukiko on site in Santiago. And in 2029, the plan is to designate that year International Year of Planetary Defense and Asteroids. And this is a work that has already started so that hopefully there could be an official United Nations declared and designated International Year in that regard. So if you are interested in helping the efforts of UNOOSA in pursuing this, you are welcome to contact Romana Koffler, who I said already is the secretary of SAMPAGE. And I want to end with this particular photograph. It is from the signing of the Outer Space Treaty in 1966, late 1966, by the three countries that are depositories under the treaty, namely the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. Thank you for your attention.
Gracias, Niklas. Un ángulo distinto, un problema fascinante. Ofrezco la palabra. ¿No? Allá. Fondo.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Walter here from the Chilean Air Force. I have a question about the COSPAR. What's COSPAR stand in the testing of military-grade weapons in space, whether they be for air defense or maybe other techniques?
So I had some difficulties hearing your question, but I can try. You're asking if COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, is involved in the matter of security, meaning military activities in outer space. Was that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
No, COSPAR is dealing with the peaceful uses of outer space. So actually, COSPAR is not really involved in research, in scientific research for defense purposes or other military purposes. So it's really a network of scientists around the world dealing with space exploration. So it is really the core activity and objective of COSPAR is space exploration.
Adam.
Hello, Niklas. It's Victoria here. It's a pleasure to see you again. Niklas, I have a follow-up question. In your opinion, which is the role that in the coming future the space law must play in order to protect Antarctic environment from the pollution coming from space due to the space debris issue?
Can you repeat a bit, because I had some difficulties in hearing you? How governments should? Can you repeat your question?
Now, my question is, in your own opinion, which role must play the space law in the coming future in order to protect Antarctic environment due to the issue of space debris and the pollution that is coming from the outer space activities down on Antarctic oceans?
Okay, now I get it. Oh, that is a question, the question, and of course it requires a good answer. And as we know, these are really the core of complexities in global governance today. And we know already that there are states that wish to see amendments to the already established treaty regime on outer space activities, not least the Outer Space Treaty. There are also some states that advocate the codification of international space law into a single instrument, like what was done with the Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS. And there is quite many states that advocate no further changes or further changes to the established treaties. And quite many states are actually also not interested in negotiating new legally binding instruments in the field of the peaceful uses of outer space. So what is interesting to note is that CUPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, as we know, in the 60s and 70s, managed to adopt 5 treaties, 5 legally binding instruments. But after 1979 Moon Agreement, there was no consensus to continue treaty making at the global level represented by CUPUS. So we have the sets of principles from the 80s and 90s, which in fact deal with quite substantial and important matters, not least the use of nuclear power sources in outer space, but they are voluntary, non-legally binding instruments. Now, in 2000 and up till 2020, we had a period of really looking into the implementation of the obligations and rights under the established legal regime in outer space. So CUPUS adopted General Assembly resolutions, which nevertheless, they are, as we know, non-legally binding voluntary instruments, but nevertheless, they are politically binding. And in those resolutions, there are also you can say that there is some common interpretation made to the treaty regime. And the latest instrument is the long-term sustainability guidelines for 2019. Why am I saying this? Well, it's in fact simple. It is that there is no consensus to enact new treaties, to make new treaties in this particular area of activities. So it is really, I think, it's important that we have the treaties, the 5 treaties, although the Moon Agreement is only ratified by 18 states, as we know, which in my personal view is a pity, because the Moon Agreement is a very innovative and quite a modern treaty from the late 1970s. But that's a fact. It's only 18 states parties to that treaty, and none of the major spacefaring nations have ratified the Moon Agreement. So we have the Outer Space Treaty if we are now looking into the fundamental principles and leave aside Liability Convention and Registration Convention. But the Rescue Agreement is also there and deals also with the return of space debris from planet Earth. Your question about Antarctica, and it's not only Antarctica, it's also other areas on planet Earth. I think this might be a concern that will continue, but your question was whether space law can do anything. I'm not so sure that there would be any consensus in the foreseeable future for any new legally binding instruments, but states should continue coming together and do their utmost in developing guidelines and also to implement the guidelines already at hand. So I think it's a combination of instruments that realistically we will see in the foreseeable future. Don't forget that when we are now moving closer and closer to I would say, multiple activities on the moon and other celestial bodies in the solar system, we might also see, in a way, similar concerns with the environment of those bodies, not least orbital environments. And I'm thinking about the moon, where we could say in the next 20, 30 years, there will be many states that will have operations on the moon, and we might actually see space debris problems also arising around such such bodies, and not only planet Earth. So this is something that we have to keep in mind, in my opinion, that the lessons learned from the orbits around planet Earth should also be taken note of when we plan our future activities for the moon and other celestial bodies. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Niklas. Muy interesante la presentación. Como dije anteriormente, un ángulo distinto, pero no menos importante. Con esto terminamos esta sección y pasamos al receso. Les pido que por favor a las 4:30 en punto estemos en la sala de regreso. Gracias.